It's almost a month since KZN Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi made damning allegations of corruption and political interference in the South African Police Service. As a result of the allegations, President Cyril Ramaphosa placed Minister Senzo Mchunu on special leave and instituted a commission of inquiry to probe the claims. Now, at the same time, the Patriotic Alliance Deputy President and Joburg Transport MMC, Kenny Kunene, was found at the house of murder-accused Gatiso Molefe during his arrest. With all the allegations made against security clusters, New South Institute Director Dr. Ivor Chipkin looks into the police service in the country and is joining us to tell us more about it. Dr. Chipkin, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. So you have penned a piece called South Africa's Police Service. It services the ANC insiders and not its people. And throughout this piece, you take us back to when during the apartheid times, the police were really there to serve and pursue the political opponents and not necessarily to take care of crime. And then you take us into the new age where we then speak about Jackie Selebi as a police commissioner and everything that happened up until this day. What's your comparison and the likening of how the police service then served the political elites and how we're seeing things playing out today?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for having me on the show this morning. I think what's really important is to recognize the very impressive achievements in the early days of the transition, or the first decade after the transition, the first decade after democracy. Some very impressive achievements are made in bringing the police under civilian control for the first time, really, in our history. And what that means essentially is that the police, for a short 10 years in South Africa's history, are moved away from essentially playing a political role, defending and reproducing and protecting the political class. And in that case, it was the class of politicians protecting and maintaining apartheid. So shifting them away from the primary role of the police was to reproduce the apartheid system. We have this extraordinary period of about 10 years where the police's primary role is being understood to service ordinary South Africans. Now, for white South Africans, they'd been familiar with the police services that had addressed their private interest. If there was a robbery, for example, or a break-in or a murder, the police responded fairly well to white South Africans. But for black South Africans, they'd never had the experience of a police service that responded to their private interests. So, black South Africans couldn't phone the police and expect them to rock up at their door if there was a robbery, or if a neighborhood was unsafe. They couldn't go to the police for that kind of protection. But with the first years of democracy, something incredible happens. There are a whole range of interventions that are made that bring the police under civilian control for the first time and shift the culture and the focus of the police towards dealing with crimes facing ordinary South Africans and what I've called in other work social emergencies which ordinary South Africans face, especially black South Africans. So I think, again, incredibly important achievements. During the apartheid period, for example, black South Africans in townships and in rural areas, for example, largely had to provide for the security for themselves through neighborhood watches, various kind of vigilante groups, etc., street watches. Really, people had to do it for themselves. So the achievements of the 90s are impressive. Then something interesting happens in the 2000s. And we can discuss why that begins to happen. But there's a shift away from, I think, this kind of civilian focus on policing towards repoliticizing the police. And we see it in the first case with Jackie Selebi. Again, I think it's a sense that the ANC needs to bring the police under greater control of the party. And you start seeing the party, through Jackie Selebi, playing a much greater role in the selection of senior police cadres, of the National Commissioner, and defining the operational structure and also the activities of the police themselves. So you're seeing a much greater mingling of politics in policing, and a much greater sense that the role of the police essentially is to defend the political class. And in this particular case, it's the class of politicians attached to the African National Congress.
And what initialed or impacted for that shift to then take place, especially during Jackie Selebi's time?
Well, the most obvious starting point is to think of the arms deal. And of course, there are a whole range of others. We have a sense that very many people linked in high office are becoming or implicated in corruption. A independent, more professional police service and a prosecutions authority, for that matter, are beginning to pay attention to these senior politicians. The Scorpions is established. It's starting to implicate very, very senior politicians in corruption. There's the arms deal, which implicates right to the most senior leadership of the African National Congress. And I think the party itself is becoming very, very uncomfortable with this attention, not just in terms of individuals, but as a party as a whole. And I think their strategy was, therefore, to bring the police and the prosecutions authority under party political control. We saw this explosively during the state capture period, where there are very, very, very intensive and deliberate attempts to bring the police under the control of the Jacob Zuma elements of the African National Congress, and especially the prosecutions authority. And what it means is two things start happening. One is that certain cases are simply, certain types of crime are simply not investigated anymore. Certain types of fraud, certain types of theft, especially involving state resources. We think of the enormous cases at Eskom, at Transnet, at PRASA, for example. Many of those cases have still not fully been ventilated or investigated. So an interruption of police investigations, but also then, to the extent that cases are investigated, an interruption of prosecution. So even if they get to the prosecutions process, the prosecution authority is heavily politicized and they simply don't make their way to court. And that's largely been the lie of the land in South Africa for the last, well, nearly 20 years, 25 years of a highly politicized police structure and a highly politicized prosecutions authority.
And this now then leads to what we're seeing today. I mean, 4 weeks on since those damning allegations made by the KZN Police Commission. I mean, you've been monitoring the situation as New South Institute. Just talk to us in terms of those allegations that have been made by Mkhwanazi and what you think then this shift is going to make within the police force, if any.
Well, I think the biggest lesson of these new claims is that what we thought was a structure or a process or a relationship we thought was potentially going to be interrupted after the end of the Jacob Zuma period clearly hasn't. That those sorts of that deep implication of politicians with criminal networks has not been interrupted. And so what we're seeing is a continuity of a long-standing practice that has affected South Africa. Let's also understand that it's not just the politicization of the leadership that has affected crime fighting in South Africa. It's that it's twisted the whole shape of the police structure. So, for example, I've been doing work just tracking sort of big structural changes in the police, spending patterns, employment patterns, and there are a couple of extraordinary trends which we've monitored over the last 20 years. So, for example, initially there was a huge investment in what was called visible policing, make policing more visible, more roadblocks, a sense of a greater presence of ordinary police in South Africa. Huge fanfares made around that, and yet the actual budgets applied to the police for visible policing we see drop dramatically. The number of ordinary policemen, the number of kind of constables available for being present on the street or responding to everyday emergencies, there are simply fewer of them. Much fewer of them. The investments into police stations, for example, for vehicles, many of us, if we go to police stations, we notice how drab, how dreary they are, how poor the infrastructure is, because what there is just a lack of investment in the buildings themselves, a lack of investment in vehicles, a lack of investment in the ordinary day equipment you need in order to do your job as a police officer. Never mind guns and those sorts of things, but fingerproof kits, walkie-talkies, all these sorts of the basic kinds of things you need to do your policing jobs. And what it means is that the ordinary police in our suburbs, in townships, in rural areas are incredibly vulnerable relative to criminals and organized criminals, which means in many circumstances they are reluctant, even if they have goodwill and are well prepared, they are reluctant to enter dangerous areas because in many cases they are outgunned. We know from the Western Cape, for example, that the South African police are often outgunned by criminal groups. So what you've seen is a politicization of the top, which affects what cases are investigated, what cases end up in the prosecutions, but also an underinvestment in the everyday equipment, the everyday infrastructure we need in order to deal with crime. And so what you've seen is a politicization at the top and a massive rise in crime as we experience it on an everyday basis, because simply the police are ill-equipped and unable to deal with the challenges they face.
And does this then bring as to why the massive rise in crime, not just that, but the types of crimes that we're seeing in the country. I mean, from extortions to having syndicates run for whether they're bringing in drugs or human trafficking in the country. Does that heighten the danger and the types of crimes that we are then seeing because the police service is so focused on other agendas?
I think it definitely does. And I think it also makes some of this criminality so brazen. I mean, to have, criminal networks that are very sort of involved in politics, but also openly being present in dinners and functions with senior politicians. It's very, very brazen. And I think it relates to the fact that they feel quite secure. They feel quite safe, that if they make a phone call to a senior minister, that certain pressure will be brought to bear on certain processes, that cases will disappear or cases will slow down, or there will be a circulation of investigating staff. I think in many cases, especially organized criminals, are feeling quite secure in the current situation because they have leverage through politicians.
So, Ivor, I mean, from what you're saying, this seems to be too far gone. What would you then recommend to prevent or even just dismantle some of these criminal politician linkages in the near future?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think it relates to the way in which the current situation is being dealt. My own sense is that we've had attempts in the past to deal with this through the executive, through cabinet. I don't think they work. I think what is required is that the solution requires taking this out of the hands of the executive, out of the hands of the president and of the cabinet, and placing this firmly in the hands of parliament and parliamentary committees. So my own sense is that the judicial inquiry should not be one appointed by the president and reporting to the president. I think this is something that should be conducted in and through parliament, and we need to bring civil and civilian control back over the police. We made enormous headway in the 1990s of reforming a far more entrenched and authoritarian police regime from the apartheid period. I think we made enormous progress in bringing that under civilian control in the 1990s. I think it's doable again. I think this time we have to move through the path through to bring it under parliamentary control. We've had extraordinary party political changes since last year, a government of national unity, and I really think this is the time to change the way in which we deal with the police, move away from political appointments of senior police staff, for example, of the National Commissioner. I don't think this should be an appointment by the president. I really think that we need to rethink that whole appointment process of the senior leadership of the police and bring the police firmly under parliamentary control for the first time.